Cool. So thanks for joining me. And this is kind of a last minute announcement. It's not really last minute, spur of the moment because I've been really excited about announcing this. I have a book coming out. I've been writing it for, well, off and on for a year and a half, but I really started writing it full force in about since like early July when I did the colloquium on violence and religion conference. And you can see that talk. It's on my YouTube channel. It's the science of violence. And after I did that talk, I had managed to consolidate this theory of violence uh, into like a 20-minute presentation, which I then was able to pitch to people at the conference in like 30 seconds at a time. And it ended up being actually very successful. And these are some of the top sort of academic names in the world of violence and religion and all this. And so and what I told them was essentially like a very simple hypothesis on violence, which I've written about quite extensively and made videos about now on the channel. And so after doing that, as soon as I got on the plane, I just started rewriting the book because I had written a like a really awful draft of it that nobody will ever see. And and then since then I've sort of like put it all together into a single book. I did one version of it already as like a temp copy, which is like 400 pages. It's way too much. It's way too. It's not like it's hardly readable. Um, but now I've cut it down. It's going to be called if these fists could talk. Them. This is not the final cover art. I'll put a picture of the cover art on here in just a second here. It's called If These Fists Could Talk, a stuntman's unflinching take on violence. You can see it in the thumbnail. You can see a picture of the and my latest community post. And so I talk about the. It's a story, a true story. There's a little bit of stunt people lore in there, but it's a true story of how we started Super Alloy, which is the company I own. And we did God of War Ragnarok. We did Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2. We worked on Mortal Kombat 1. We did a bunch of the cinematics here for that. And we've done a bunch of games at this place, and we've worked on some films too. And the book is all about how we started the company and got the contract to do God of War Ragnarok. And sort of nested within that is a is sort of like an emerging theory of violence. And it sort of ties in with a lot of the stuff I had worked on, starting with old stunt people films, and then how I started using more of what I knew about violence when I made Rope-a-Dope 2. Some real life experiences too of getting robbed at gunpoint while shooting Rope-a-Dope 2. That was fun. And a lot of this stuff kind of came together into a theory because, as I've talked about before on this channel, I've done a fair amount of research, and so far nobody has written down a coherent theory of human violence. And I thought, well, how cool would it be if a stuntman gave his take on what violence is? Because to me, it's very simple. Um, the way that violence is uh, typically described or theorized is that it's this kind of like amalgamation of like uh, primate tendencies and hormones, and we sort of have this bipolar view of what a human is, which is like on the one hand, humans have all of these sort of component features such as high intellect, language, kinship, religion, and all these things that are sort of like evolved from monkeys, right? It's like from apes. But then there's this other kind of like annoying aspect of humans, which is we have aggression and violence, and this is sort of seen as an evolutionary stowaway. And there's all kinds of like theories as to where this comes from, right? And it's like in our limbic system, they say, or who knows, right? There's a whole bunch of theories, but like the fact is that like violence is not really treated as anything like noteworthy in people. It's just sort of seen as a bad thing rather than being this thing that's actually extremely different about people. And so, because of that, because it's not seen as a special thing, it sort of gets lost in the fray. And so it actually becomes very difficult for people to understand what the difference is between human violence and animal combat. And so academics, they tend to just say like, well, animal combat is like dangerous and aggressive and it's for territory. And human violence is just that, but like worse. Well, it's like, how is it worse exactly? Let's elaborate on this. And nobody has ever said what exactly is worse about human violence. Of course, we all know it's worse. Of course, we know that it's like a crisis. Of course, we know that it can destroy the world. We all know that. We also know that it tends not to. It tends not to destroy the world. Our record is like 1-0 of not destroying the world and of destroying everybody, right? Yeah, of course there have been dips, but overall, like our population's up. That's a very optimistic view on it. I know that's kind of like a Steven Pinker view on violence. I'm not pro-violence, but I tend to be pro-human. And and so what I say is, well, how about we just like set up, try and figure out what exactly is different about human violence? Because as an action designer, when I was doing Rope-a-Dope 2, I took inspiration from a lot of these guys, and some of them would say like violence in humans naturally escalates because we have a highly mimetic nature. And that was it. And that's Rene Girard's argument, right? It's from Battling to the End. And in battling to the end, he doesn't really indicate what exactly is different about human violence. He just says, well, it's just because we have a more mimetic nature, and therefore we escalate because we like mimic each other's violence or something. And as I was making Rope-a-Dope 2, I was like, yeah, okay, I'll try and make that work, but I couldn't quite, like I was actually sort of like writing out, I was sort of drawing outside the lines when I was doing Rope-a-Dope 2, because like in Rope-a-Dope 2, the Dope and Dennis, we don't actually mimic each other. We're like one-upping each other. That's how actual escalation works, right? And I was like, well, why are we one-upping each other? We're not actually mimicking each other. It has nothing to do with mimicry. It's because we don't know what the object of aggression is. We don't know what the weapon is. And that's different with people, right? Because with animals, you know exactly what the weapon is going to be. There's like no issue with animal. Like no animal goes into combat going like, I wonder if he's going to bring an antler, or if he's going to bring a hoof, or if today he's going to have a claw. Maybe he'll have teeth, or maybe he'll have like a longer tooth today. Like they don't worry about that, right? Or maybe he'll bring a rock. They just don't think about it, because if they did, they would do it themselves. And that's interesting because there's a lot of animals that could bring those things. Like they can bring tools. Chimpanzees will bring tools and tools. They'll bring rocks around with them. They'll find a pile of rocks, and they'll find their like favorite rock, and they'll move it around. They'll leave that rock there, and there's an anvil over there, and they'll get a nut, and they'll take a nut, and then they'll get another chimp. Like, hey, come over here, little chimp, little baby chimp, come over here. Puts the rock down, grabs their favorite rock, goes to the anvil, and smashes the nut. One of these like special cocoa nuts or whatever. It's got like 3 chambers to it, so you can't just obliterate it. You have to. There's like a technique to it. Chimps can do this stuff. Even like they're like monkeys that can do this stuff, right? And they can teach the young to do it. So like tool usage is obviously incredible with animals. Nobody's debating that. But why don't they use them in combat? They just don't do it, right? As soon as chimps go to war, they should get those rocks and start smashing each other, and they don't. They might throw one, but that's it. They don't use them in combat. They actually don't have this issue. Humans do, and that is a problem because we don't know what the object of combat is going to be. Whereas in predation, it's like with animals, they can do whatever the hell they want. Like they'll use like vultures will use these like African vultures will use rocks and smash open. They'll smash open what's that big bird? Ostrich eggs. But they don't like take rocks and smash other vultures. So for whatever reason, the species are like locked off from doing this. Either the species are like incapable of using their objects in combat, or they choose not to, and they're just really smart. In which case, they're like morally superior to us, right? So this is like this is you could argue like Hans. Is it Hans the Wall or Franz the Wall? I always get this guy's name wrong. It's Franz the Wall. You could argue like Franz the Wall, that we're just not smart enough to understand animals. That could be true. Maybe animals are just choosing not to use their objects of predation in combat, but for some reason animals will still kill their own, right? And this is another thing that Girard, he sort of claimed, is that like humans are unique in the fact that we mob each other, and that's like not really true. Chimpanzees do it, meerkats do it. You see it in like all kinds of primates doing this. hyenas and wolves and brown rats, they'll all mob their own and they'll kill their own. That's like not an issue. But they just don't grab objects. If they're capable of using objects in any other way, they just won't use them in combat. There are, sometimes instances where chimpanzees will lob a rock, they'll swing a stick around, but it's never like a killing blow, right? The technique is always in the natural objects of aggression. Like chimps don't really like work on stick technique in combat. Now, here's another thing that's so fascinating. Like they're really good at throwing rocks, and they will actually make rock piles. And they have a there's this paper on cumulative stone throwing capacities with chimpanzees, and like they'll throw rocks accurately at a tree stump to make a loud sound, and it's like an intimidation call, right? Sort of like a display, they call it, right? A charging display almost, except it's so you can hear it from far away. But they don't do that to other chimps. They just don't do it. And if they do, it's like a one-off, right? It's never like, let's stone the chimp to death by doing the thing we do over here on the tree. Let's now take those rocks and stone our fellow chimp to death because they violated the whatever. They just don't do that. If they did, we would find chimps buried under rocks. And we just don't. If they did do that, you would find chimps bringing objects to battle. But they don't. I'm going to look at some questions. So there's a lot of comments coming in. So let's see. Naturalists have observed Divina. Naturalists have observed tribes of monkeys making war on other tribes. Okay, war is one thing, but combat with objects is completely different, right? If you don't know what the object of combat is, then you have a crisis, right? Because as soon as you introduce objects, well, you actually like kind of break the rules of combat. Right. So with a chimpanzee, if you took a rock as a chimpanzee and you bashed another chimp over the head with that rock, you would win. You would completely win. They just don't do it though. But if you were able to do that, there would be a crisis, and then so they would bring rocks in anticipation of that, or they'd bring more chimpanzees, right? And you'd have this escalation. So escalation does not factor into these primate wars. They're very stable. There might be a casualty or two. The Gombe chimpanzee war was one that's like very high casualty count of 10 or 11. 11 chimps died in this war. We obliterate them by comparison. Not even close. So to think that there's like some gradation between like chimpanzee combat and what we're capable of, I think is like it's just like a gross, it's like a miscalculation of what we do, because what we do is actually mechanically different. On killing, I have it. I have Grossman's book on killing. I haven't read it yet. Okay, well, FIA is saying the World War I era of war speaks to this a lot. It was a frustrating era of warfare changes for many. Yes. So it's interesting. I wish I had a longer cord. I need a wireless headset. Where is it? It's is it this? Where I can't find it. Oh, where did that book go? Here it is. Pursuit of Power. So William McNeill talks about World War I and Pursuit of Power. It's a very good book, and it's very hard. This book is so hard. I hated it, but it was so good. He talks about World War I and sort of the escalation of technology, and technology sort of like building upon itself, and it became this technological. It was a technological race that became an arms race. And so this is also the issue with human violence, is that as soon as we carpenter the world with anything, it could be cutting a tree down or anything. As soon as we carpenter the world, we can weaponize it. And again, this is something animals just don't have an issue with. Like when beavers cut down a tree, they don't start making hacksaws. They don't start making like clubs out of the tree. They'll use it to make a shelter, but it's never anything higher than that. Other species tend to fight by numbers. Ants attacking other insects. The escalation arms race came with technology, a better spear, better suit of armor. So again, here's a chicken or egg question. I have to pull this in 1 second. So here's the chicken or egg question, and one of the reasons I wanted to talk about myth today. So the standard belief is that Homo faber, right? Is like man the tool maker. the human tool maker. This is like a sort of the way that humans differentiated themselves from primates, from the last common ancestor, was by like building upon tools, right? And one of the tools that humans are well known for is is like a hand axes, right? Like the Acheulean hand axe. What this is. This is supposedly from 200,000 to million and a half years ago. I've got the certificate over there. I'll show you in a second. And the idea is that humans started making these tools for hunting and for cutting animal hides and stuff. And frankly, I have no idea how you would use something like this. This looks more like a gemstone to me. It looks like it would be cut for some other purpose. I'm not going to get into that right now. But here's the chicken or egg question. Okay, so if humans started out as tool makers, well, at what point did the tools start turning into tools for warfare? That's my question. And one of the issues with the mainstream narrative is that as soon as you just start thinking of humans as tool makers first and then violent later, right? Like tool makers and hunters first and then war later. The issue with that is that there is no myth. There are no myths about the introduction of warfare. They don't exist, right? There's no clear myth about, well, we used to not fight and then we did. I can only find two, and I would love input on this, by the way. I can only think of two. One of them is Cain and Abel, and the other one is Hesiod's Works and Days. And of course, there are war gods. There are also, gods for hunting. But there's shockingly little regarding like the introduction of warfare, right? It's like it's always that like people have always been at war, and there's no introduction for warfare itself, which would seem to be a pretty big deal because there are tons of myths about the introduction of fire, tons of myths about the introduction, even transitions from like animal to human, tons of these, right? Almost every totem clan in Australia and Africa and India, they all have these myths about like, or like in Polynesia, they all have these myths about like, well, we used to be crabs and then we became human, or like a crocodile came and like married a man, and we, or like married a walrus, I don't know, and then made humans, right? We even have myths about the origin of people, but we don't have myths about the origin of violence. It's like there are very few, nowhere near as many as origins of fire. And yet, okay, if humans started out making tools and then gradually those became used for war, that is a huge crisis because that fundamentally separates human combat from animal combat. Because animal combat does not put the species at risk. Human combat does. That's why we're talking about it, right? If it were as stable as animal combat, then we would just like fight for our hierarchies, and we tend not to. That's the crazy thing, is we tend not to do it, and the reason that it seems like we do this all the time is because like one little incident will blow up into a world war, and that's why we try and stop every little incident. Michael Esquivel, do their hands have the same dexterity as ours? They're also really strong, so they don't need to use tools as much as we do. Well, look, like, some people say that thumb opposability is the defining trait, but there's like a bunch of these monkeys that have more opposable thumbs than we do. I don't know what it is, but Napier's book, I'll get it. I feel like I'm gonna accidentally hit escape. You guys ever edit? You guys remember editing in Premiere, like decades ago? And when you left it exporting, and then you clicked off to another window, and you're using, of course your computer's running at like 10% of its normal capacity. You click off and you're doing some of this, and you hit escape and it quits your export. I feel like I'm going to do that with my keyboard right now. So this is Napier's book, Roots of Mankind. Napier is like a hand expert. He's like a hand guy, a tool guy. And I think that he has thumb opposability in this. And I'll pull up. So here, opposable thumb, 178. That's the big chapter on it. 178. Okay, so yeah, he shows her example, like how the thumb is more suited with humans for gripping tools, right? And that's like arguably true, but there are, yeah, and so you have living primates here. So you have a lemur, which is like not very opposable. Oh my gosh, what is this? This is a woolly monkey. That doesn't have. There's no opposability. That's like 5 fingers, literally 5 fingers on this one, right? You have the macaque and a macaque. Look at the macaque's thumb. Now this is interesting. Look, uh, look at the macaque's. The macaque's thumb is slightly opposable. You notice that? That's this one right here. The macaque's thumb is slightly opposable. And then orangutan's thumb also slightly opposable. And you've seen orangutans do some pretty amazing things. They'll spearfish. So I'm not convinced that thumb opposability is the defining trait. I thought that there was another. I thought he had a chart 128. Let me see. I haven't read this whole book. Oh, here we go. This is a useful chart. So an opposability index. Sorry, it's going to be out. I'll just read it to you. So humans, so man has let's see, this is an opposability index. So man has an opposability index mean of 65, and I assume that's like an angle. So maybe full 90 degrees would be 90 or 100, I don't know. But so the mean on humans is extremely high, but mandrill is 58. It's like right next to it. It's right below it. Baboons 57. Now mandrills, as far as I know, are not really like making complicated tools or using complicated tools. Patas monkeys 55, and then all the way down to orangutan at 40. And gorillas at 47. So gorillas have actually like more opposable thumbs than chimpanzees 43. Macaque is 53. So a mandrill is like the closest one. So I thought that humans had less opposable thumbs than some of these primates and monkeys, but perhaps not. But I'm not convinced, by the way, I'm not convinced that this is like what caused us to become human or something. This is just like part and parcel to what makes us human. One of the things about the thumb too, I don't think I'll get banned for talking about this, but like you can strangle somebody to death with your thumbs. If you don't have opposable thumbs, you can't. It might be hard to do that. I don't know if they've ever done a study on that. Seems unethical. But then you don't need like that's actually like a very interesting technique because it's like no wear and tear on on killing another living being. Cool. I'm getting a lot of comments in here. This is fun. So yeah, one of the reasons I wanted to open up this discussion was to like bring some outside opinions and like test this. Moveset mastery. Oh, hi, Eric. How do you juggle between things like evolutionary psychology and religion or creationism? I'd like to know. Oh, it's a great question. I study Bible weekly with a group. We're called Overthinkers Anonymous. And we're like non-doctrinal, right? And I'm not a biblical literalist, but I do think that it's interesting that the Bible, for example, has some very it's unique in that it's got like a few. Okay, there are a few things. So the first thing is like the Adam's rib. And so there's a story about like Adam's rib being removed to make Eve, which has always been kind of strange sounding to me. I always thought like, well, how can you have an odd number of ribs either before or after? It never made sense. But then there's this interesting analysis of it, which is that the rib is like a euphemism for the baculum, and the baculum is the penile bone. Primates, actually, tons of animals have this. Humans are like very unique in that we don't have a baculum. It makes it very difficult to force copulation. So the fact that if the male baculum was sort of sacrificed so that marriage could work, that's actually like a pretty amazing amount of wisdom in that little sentence. And then the theory is that that is a priestly document, Genesis 1 and 2, I think, or 2, maybe I don't know, but whoever wrote that might have been trying to dodge the censors at the time. Like he might have like tried to make an anatomical sort of distinction. Like, hey, men don't have this thing, but animals do. Then he might have been trying to dodge some censorship by saying that. Another thing is, it indicates a sort of like the mindset of whoever wrote Genesis, which is, in Genesis, it might have been written by multiple people, but there's like supposedly the priestly document, the Elohist, who uses the term Elohim, which is God in the King James, and then the Yahwist, who uses Yahweh, which is the Lord in the King James. So there's a bunch of different authors potentially that piece this, this book together. But one interesting part also in Genesis 2 or 3 is that it says that man is to leave his mother and father to go to his wife. And that sort of sounds like, like what we do, right? Like, yeah, we're guys, we move out and we go and meet a girl, but it's actually different because like the implication, I think, is that you leave your parents' house, you go and move to her house. And this is what Jacob does, right? And it actually is evidence, perhaps, that the author was thinking in terms of matrilocal marriage, where the man goes and lives with the woman. It indicates probably that they were following kind of Canaanite matrilineal laws, and this actually makes a lot more sense in the context of Abraham. So there's a lot of things, and the last thing that I think that one of the most compelling biblical stories is the Cain and Abel story because it's the first murder in the book. It's the first death, actually. Like nobody dies before that. It's the first death. Uh, the murder is done not like we like to think, excuse me, that as cavemen, right, as cave women and cavemen, that we killed each other so that we could get sustenance, right, so that we could get food, shelter, have sex, drink water, whatever, territory. But Cain and Abel actually indicates that the reason Cain kills Abel is because of religious reasons. Like violence is lofty. It's a religious phenomenon. It's actually like not meaningless. It always has meaning. Not that it's good, but there's always meaning behind it. It's always very lofty. And I think that there's probably some truth to that because I'm not sure how you could have religiosity and violence at different times. It seems as though you'd have to have them at the same time. Um, so I think that that's like a pretty that's kind of a profound wisdom that I'm not really seeing anywhere else. Again, I'm not saying that there was a guy named Cain and a guy named Abel. I don't doubt for a minute that these were like archetypal, you know, like symbolic names of some kind, right? Like Adam is not the guy's name. Adam means man, and it's like a cognative red. So yeah, I think that you can derive wisdom from books like the Bible without thinking that without worrying about whether or not it's all literal. Like you gotta kind of separate yourself out from that stuff and kind of look at like the subtext, read between the lines, and then you benefit a lot. You can benefit from every book that way. Okay, that was a lot on the Bible. um, oh, the last thing about Cain and Abel is that like how is the murder resolved with a sign? And I think that that's so profound because that is the resolution to violence, like specifically to human violence, which I call reciprocal object-based aggression. I used to call it recursive. I call it reciprocal object-based aggression, which is what makes us so different from animal combat. And the only resolution to this kind of violence, ROBA, that's the acronym, reciprocal object-based aggression, ROBA. The only resolution to that is some kind of deferral, and you can sort of like transfer this energy of violence into language. And I think that that's the only way language can even exist. Otherwise, you just have a very kind of like rudimentary symbol system like you have with animals, where like even chimpanzees, like the maximum number of symbols that a chimpanzee could create was like 25. And there was like a very, very small kind of grammar that they used. It just had like 3 to 4 parts. Andrew Halloran, this is such a great book, by the way. Song of the Ape. If you want to read about chimpanzee uh, communication. It's not language, it's communication. If you want to read about that, Song of the Ape is the best. I don't think it gets better. He did his homework. He really did it. And so, but that's what makes humans unique is that we have language because we have to have language. If we don't have language, then we only have roba. And if we only have roba, then we destroy each other. Okay, moving on. Let's see, Davina. Let's see. Tools for hunting become weapons. Early humans or pre-humans knapped flint with stone. Some very sharp obsidian blades in South America. Yeah, but I'm not convinced that these were. I'm not convinced that these were weapons or tools at all. They're just kind of useless as tools. Stefan Milo has an interesting video essay about like he says that it might have been for luring females. I think that it's probably more along the lines of like a bride price. You would have used this to pay her father, or who knows? Maybe the father used this to pay the groom. Again, matrilocal marriage. He might have used this to pay the groom to come and live there and marry his daughter so that he could have an heir. You have to think more in terms of like ancient kinship when you think about people. Like people weren't roaming around randomly. That's never been people. That's new. We do that now. That never used to be the case. Every ancient society, every one of them, this entire shelf is about family. Family in ancient society. Every tribe had kinship, right? So if you had two tribes, you had tribe A and tribe B. You have tribe A and tribe B. Okay, now there's a river between the two of them, right? And the river has fish, and they're gonna fight over that river. So what do? They intermarry so that they can work together. So they trade often they'll trade men. Like the males will actually go over. Male A will go to tribe B, male B will go to tribe A. So you have a bunch of foreigners living in both tribes. So that if war breaks out, then you're going to destroy a bunch of marriages. So it was a natural check against violence. It was a natural check against violence. And this is called a direct exchange. Direct exchange. Sometimes there will be multiple. Right? You have tribe A, B, and C. So A will give, a husband or a bride to B, and then B will pay. And then B will give a bride or a husband to C, and C will pay. And then C will give a bride to A or a groom, and A will pay, right? And if you renege on that or you go the other direction, there's a huge penalty because there's this like cycle with the three going through each other. This is so that they don't fight. People criticize this guy a lot, Lewis Morgan, ancient society. Okay, fine. He he's very critical of like primitives and savages. He uses that term, but they all did. Okay, like look beyond that. Look at the data that he has in this book. In particular, look at the Aztecs that he writes about and the Iroquois Confederacy. And basically, his hypothesis is very. He was an expert, by the way, on Native Americans. He wrote an entire. I have that. It's too big to pull down. He wrote an entire lexicon about kinship terms in North America and like trace them back. It's crazy. The anthropology work at the time was crazy. But essentially, the way that these tribes maintained a like a this like confederacy was that you had like in the Iroquois Confederacy, like every one of the 5 or 6 tribes, there's like a sixth small tribe. Every tribe had to have members of every other tribe living within it as a natural check against violence. And they tended not to go to war. And so what you find, okay, so it's very natural then to look at these ancient societies, Neolithic and Stone Age sometimes, Paleolithic, to look at these tribes and say there's no evidence of violence, like there's no mass warfare. They weren't going to war all the time. Well, because they had extremely rigid kinship rules, very rigid, right? And there was like this balance that they kept. And the only sort of warfare that you had was like random raids and retribution and headhunting and whatnot. And those might have been rare. I think per capita, yeah, Steven Pinker claims that per capita it's the same as like modern violence. I'm not sure that's true. Maybe it is, but I don't think we can deny that like violence was at least a crisis because otherwise you wouldn't have these rigid rules. You wouldn't have rigid rules around kinship, religion, because like they were trying to survive each other, and that's sort of the point. That's sort of the point of the hypothesis is that I lost my train of thought. Anyway, um, all that's to say, uh, the trading of these hand axes. I think that the reason that they existed in huge numbers, and Mark White's book. I really need a wireless headset. This book. Oh, Mark White. Why? Why did you write a 450-page white paper? Look at this. It is like now the data in this book is fantastic. Fantastic data. Very dry. It's like a 480-page Trisket. So Mark White kind of makes the same standard claim, which is that hand axes, like this one, were originally tools, right? And it's sort of like this evolutionary step beyond primate tools. And therefore, humans were originally materialistic, utilitarian, just trying to get by, right? And that was like the point of those tools was to like kill animals, eat, blah blah blah, right? And it's sort of like religion is treated as this as this like distraction almost. It's like people had religion and magic so that they could understand the environment around them and survive. I just don't think that's true at all. But at any rate, I'm not going to get into that. But the problem with this book is that Mark White never talks about warfare ever. There's like in the index. You would think you look at this cover, you would think that you're going to find at least a little bit about warfare and violence. All right, well let's look in the index. All right, looking in the index, let's look under violence first. Let's see, violence, VIL Villafranche, Vindicate, visual, no violence, no violence. How is that? Okay, let's look for war. All right, ready? All right, here's Wanson Pitt. Here's Wanson Pitt. Warren. War. There's no warfare. Hello. Okay, so but that's a symptom. I'm telling you, this is a symptom of seeing human violence as a gradual, as like a difference of degree and not of kind. Because if you just think of human violence as like a more intense animal violence, and if you just think of these as utilitarian objects, then you cannot pinpoint when violence comes in. And so he doesn't. He doesn't say anything. That's crazy. This is what my book is about, by the way. Bill, how you doing, Bill? Could it be that human combat has evolved into a spiritual pursuit to conquer the base human nature of violence? Resisting something increases it, improving it is controlling it, so we conquer our impulses. I think that's exactly what like the entire human, I call it the unoptimized strategy. That's like the entire MO of human existence, which is we have this issue where we don't know what the object of combat is going to be. We just don't know. And so we could either like go blindly out into the world and sort of like face this and bring our own weapons and sort of engage in combat. And maybe that happened once. But in general, everybody's going to die if that happens because you're going to escalate beforehand, during the fight, after the fact. You're going to do vengeance. There's going to be vengeance networks created, and all these things are going to start kicking into gear to like resolve violence. And inevitably, you're going to have institutions in place that stop the violence. Like it's inevitable. And that's not what you see with animals. And so the unoptimized strategy is like how do we transfer everything that we do with violence? And I kind of feel like I should just show you a picture from the book. I'm gonna share a picture from the book. This will be fun. Let me see. I'm gonna do some OBS magic here. Okay. So all right. So I'm gonna grab an image that I made to kind of exemplify what I'm talking about here. Give me 1 second. Books in, let's see, image. I think it's under images. Is it that one? Yeah. Okay. So this is sort of, I'll just turn off my video for now so you can see. So this is an image that I made to kind of, that, elucidates what I'm talking about. In a riot, you have the riot officer on the left and you have the protester on the right. And the riot officer is anticipating that the protester is going to throw a Molotov cocktail. The protester is anticipating that the riot cop is going to shoot a a can of tear gas, right? There's probably some truth to that. But they don't quite know. And that's why you have a long standoff. You're not immediately going to run into battle because this actually isn't the end of the anticipation phase. Instead, you keep on having these like additional anticipation phases, right? So actually, as it keeps going, you then have another level of anticipation where the riot officer is going to anticipate, well, actually the protester might anticipate that I'm going to block his Molotov cocktail, and the protester is going to anticipate, well, the riot officer is probably going to anticipate that I'm going to cower, right? And so you have all this, again, it's all during this anticipation phase. And you can keep going multiple levels deeper, and you have then the officers anticipating, all right, well, if I shield this thing, then they're gonna then they're gonna riots on the left side, and the protesters saying, well, if he's correct and I'm gonna cower, then he's gonna come and arrest me, right? Sorry, let me put that one up. There you go. On the left side, you see the riot officer anticipating eventually there's going to be chaos, and on the right side, the protesters eventually there's going to be an arrest, and we're going to lose our cause, right? So this is sort of like a very standard situation before any Molotov cocktails are thrown, before any tear gas rounds are fired, and they tend not to happen. That's the crazy thing. Like they may not even talk to each other. They might just stand in a lineup and nothing even happens. And I think that that's like very different with people. Right? This is not exactly what animals do. Animals will they'll stand off a little bit, but in general, an animal just like backs off. Or if there's a combat loop, it's very quick, and it's like it tends not to be lethal, and it tends to be very certain of who the victor is. And like whoever loses, when they back down, it's like they trust that that loser is backing down, and they're going to quit. They're not going to go and like bring back their cousins. And so that's what the unoptimized strategy is. And when I say unoptimized, because like our combat is not is unoptimized for setting a hierarchy. Like we have to have of course we're going to have a hierarchy. We can have this ideal that there's no hierarchy. We can have that, right? We can all sort of wish that everybody's equal. Yeah, fine. Then that's like common in every society, by the way. But the fact is, like a hierarchy will emerge, except that the hierarchy tends not to emerge out of the violence itself. The hierarchy is going to emerge out of who's the best wordsmith, who's got the best rhetoric, right? Who's the most convincing, who makes the best sacrifice, who has the most compelling, shiny object with like the highest value, right? For example, who has the most money, and all these things are kind of useless to animals, and that's why, like for humans, it's like it's always this resolution to the violence. And the question then becomes like, well, is this stuff actually real? Like if I say that I'm a magician, well, what if somebody calls my bluff? Or like if I say, well, you can't kill me, I can make rain. Like, all right, make rain. And you happen to know that the rain's coming in a day or two, and like you hit some rocks together and like pee on a newt or whatever, and the rain comes. Oh, great. Oh, well, let's try it again next year. And like next year they try, oh, great, it worked. And then the next year there's a drought, there's no rain. And then they say to you, okay, if you don't do this, then we're going to kill you. So that's the unoptimized strategy, which is that as you continue to try and defer violence through all these different forms, through rhetoric, through sacrifice, kinship, and all these different differential systems, which one actually is going to reign true? And none of us have the exact answer for that, but we can all kind of like prod at what the answer could be, right? Um, so, okay, what else we got here? We got a bunch of questions. This is great. Oh my gosh. Okay, well, going down the list. Never turn your back on an orangutan. This is Davina saying it's possible other animals developed weapon use and wiped each other out in Earth's earlier ages. Well, if that's true, we'll find it. But my hunch is that the moment you have object usage, ROBA, reciprocal object-based aggression. My hunch is that the moment you have that, you also have deferential forms, because it's like you see this, there's like this apocalyptic window, or there's like a window into the apocalypse suddenly, right? So it's something that animals, again, they don't have to deal with this because the animal weapon is certain. The outcome is almost certain, right? You can kind of like tell what's going to happen. Like you just sort of self-assess. I've got antlers. Mutual assess. He's got antlers, but one of them's broken. Here's the move, and that's it. That's the end of it, and they're probably going to run away. Or, okay, I've got a bum leg. He's got two good legs. Here's my move. I'm gonna get away. Like it's very quick, right? And yeah, animal combat can like you've seen it last for a long time, but it's surprisingly non-lethal. And so like you tend then with animals to have a very stable system where if you don't use objects in combat like with animals, then like there's no need to have civilization. There's no need to have literacy and movies. You just don't need any of that. Like everything's sort of taken care of. Of course, you have crises, but none of those crises can be resolved with language. The interesting thing about humans is that because we have this particular crisis of violence, animals don't have the crisis of violence. They have all the other same crises that we do: volcanoes and earthquakes and plagues and all that. That's the same stuff we deal with. But because we have this unique crisis of violence, well, then that sort of like opens up the combat loop so that it's constantly open. And this seems to generate something else within us that I call the recursive loop, because you're constantly trying to like take up that energy of violence and like apply it into deferral. And it seems as though the infinite sort of apocalyptic window into violence is the same window that makes words, because words have the same infinite depth. And the relationship of words is sort of like it's sort of like a proxy relationship that you can play out in speech or on paper so that you don't have to play that out with people. It's in the book. The book is called If These Fists Could Talk. Uh, Shazadster. Can we say that the mind is the tool? Well, I mean, I guess you could. The thing is that the mind itself is not enough, right? Humans aren't just a brain. Our entire being is sort of wrapped up in recursive forms, right? We were talking about the thumb earlier. I'm not sure that the thumb would be of much use for other animals, right? Yeah, we have some opposability in some other animals, but like they don't really use objects the way that we do, not for violence. And so it seems as though you know the ability ROBA, reciprocal object-based aggression, it sort of like takes over everything. And my guess is that the reason that you have such fast brain growth with hominins is that like as soon as you have that potential, then it just puts this incredible like I guess it would be a burden on the brain to like engage in deferral and language and sacrifice. And the bigger brain is not necessarily smarter, but it is better at searching the lexicon. So if you imagine that language, if I'm talking to you and you're talking to me, I'm using a bunch of words. And these words, I believe, mean the same thing to me as they do to you. Now, there are some words that don't quite mean the same thing, like violence, right? So I have to sort of like check that word out from this ledger, so to speak. Right? This ledger has all these words in it and symbols, right? Even this is a symbol in the ledger. A lot of people associate this with tool in the ledger. I don't. Right, so I'll check out that term and I'll sort of like do my remix on it and put it back in, and we'll let that play out between the two of us. And that's the rhetoric. That's rhetoric or debate or the dialectic. And I think that a bigger brain is necessary in order to like deal with the fact that there are 8 billion of us that do this every day now, and we have to sort of like have a really good search function. It's in the book. Okay, let's see. Carlos, hello to my Brazilian fan. Shazadster. So that's currency. Currency. Yeah, I mean, Yuval Harari has this annoying. Let me get it. Like this book's not bad. *Sapiens* by Yuval Harari. It's not a bad book, but he says some bad things in it. What he says is that the economy, religion, sacrifice is all imaginary, and I hate that term because imaginary doesn't really. I think that it connotes that people just invent it for convenience, right? And I don't think that it's convenience that we have language and currency. I think that I think it's the only alternative to violence, and we just can't use violence. So we have to use, and he would know that. Like, come on, like the economy is like one of the ultimate deferential devices, and currency is a sort of token that literally it's a token. Okay, in fact, that's like the purest meaning of token, which is that this coin isn't just like a piece of metal, right? That's not what it is, right? And if somebody in 10,000 years they dig up these coins, and they say like, oh well, what was this for? Well, what kind of screws did they turn with this? Well, it's this thing. Maybe they turn these screws, but these screws are flat. Maybe they use these other coins for turning these screws, right? If you look at this as pure utility, it's like garbage. It's worth nothing, because I think it's all like copper and nickel now, so it's worth about 3 cents maybe, and it's not actually worth 25 cents. But the fact that there's a face on it, the face is like this legal imprint, and if you don't have access to the legal documentation, you wouldn't know that it's illegal to put that on just whatever. So you can't make this. Like, it has to be issued by one provider, the Federal Reserve, and that's pretty deep, man. Like, you can't like look at this in a utilitarian way, and you can't just say that we just like imagine this stuff, right? This is not imaginary. We all kind of agree on this, and if you don't agree, you don't partake, and you don't actually get a token. If you have a token and you agree, then we can partake in this exchange and we can defer violence. If we don't, then we have to find some other way to defer violence, right? Ruben, I wish you were my dad, Eric. Oh, that's nice of you. I got 3 kids, but I'll happily take another kid. Uh, Move said, thanks for the insight on religion. I know it's quite complex. It's interesting to see if they have any incongruencies. Um, I mean, all religions are like a vector, right? They're always a vector towards trying to find truth. And if you have that, and by the way, like, this is also, oh wait, it's not in the book. It's in the old version. But like every philosophy and every kind of scientist out there like has some kind of a vector. Nobody is just a scientist. Everybody has some kind of meaning behind what they're doing. So if people are trying to figure out, if they're aliens, for example, there's always a meaning to that. It's not just so that you can get the data. Like, if you found that there were aliens, that would fundamentally change you in some way because you're expecting something. And like, the search for aliens really took off during the Cold War for obvious reasons, because there was no more neutral power on planet Earth that could resolve the conflict between the East and West anymore. And so without that, it's like, well, we have to find some kind of external mediator. And you see the incidence of extraterrestrials, and I think it's in Google Books, you can search this stuff, or Google Statistics. You find that it just like skyrockets in like in the late 40s, early 50s, because everybody wants this external mediator now. And it doesn't actually matter whether it's true. I think that a lot of the search for aliens is kind of based on things that, like, there's a lot of hypotheticals, man, like abiogenesis. They have to, like, they haven't proven that. You could just like, you could run a billion experiments in a lab and like just find one where you get life coming out of an amino acid. They haven't done it. So they haven't like proven that. It's sort of just like an assumption because we're here. And then there's also the assumption, which I think is even more egregious, which is that like human intelligence naturally comes out of abiogenesis eventually, like given a certain amount of time and a certain geography and a certain amount of water. Like, what then do you get human intelligence, right? Like, that's just such a like ridiculously bold statement, and it's based in a kind of a religious kind of loftiness, and we all have that. So, to say nowadays, there are a lot of people that say that they're not affiliated with religion, and I would just tell people like, okay, well, like, look deep inside and like ask yourself, are you not running from anything? Are you really not trying to live up to some kind of higher ideal? Are you really not trying to strive for some kind of greater thing? Even if you're trying not to do those things, you're you're sort of like trying to still live up to an ideal. Like, you have to adopt a religious mindset to not eat, right? If you want to not eat, and if you want to not get fat, or if you want to like not get stressed out or not think about death, like, there are religions for that. So I think the idea of like not having a religion is like bogus, but I just have a different definition. I'm checking out a term differently from the linguistic ledger, so to speak. It's in the book. Okay, so What am I doing? Let's go. Walter Wild. Don't know who Walter Wild is, but hi. Yes, I'm okay. But the karambits and katanas ain't gonna cut it anymore. I assume you have at least a Glock. I hate Glocks. I think karambits are a bunch of crap too. Katanas are not a bunch of crap, but a karambit is a bunch of crap, and I'll tell you why. It didn't used to be. It used to be very clear what karambits were for. James Frazier actually wrote about it in The Golden Bough. It's that big top shelf there. The karambit was a hidden blade because well, it's hidden. You put it in your hand, and you can't see it. Well, what's the point of that? And then like you you see guys like try and spar with a karambit versus a machete, and it's sad. You're not gonna win. And a karambit, even if it's like a hidden blade, it's like, yeah, you could probably do better. There's always a better weapon than a karambit. But a karambit was a ritual knife that you used to go up and cut the first fruits, which had actually was it would have been the last sheaf in the field. And the last sheaf was the one that had the corn god. Right, so you cut all the corn, corn grain, right? The grain god. You cut all the wheat or the rice, whatever it is, right? And there's like one little patch left, and that's where the corn god is, or the rice god. And what the Indonesians would do is that they would sneak up to it, and sometimes they'd use like a different language so that they couldn't understand them. They'd sneak up to it, and they had a hidden blade, and they'd cut it with this hidden blade, and that was the purpose of the karambit. And a lot of the time, like, there's no shame in admitting that your weapon of choice is actually a farm tool that like doesn't really have any utility in war. That's fine because like the Chinese seem to be pretty open about this for a long time until we could. Oh my gosh, we don't have 3 hours to go into this, but like the Cultural Revolution and also by the way, like the Chinese Revolution in general from 1910 onward, and Jingwu Moon really sort of like undermined the old traditional ideas of how weapons came about because they wanted to like justify these farm weapons. So like, oh no, they weren't farm weapons. They were actually, excuse me, they weren't farm tools. They were weapons. Like they were first weapons, and then you could use them to farm with. But in fact, they were farm tools for sacrifice a lot of the time, and they became weapons later on. All right. Davina and the police have the option of escalating to lethal force. I think that's a huge issue. I think that's a huge issue in police, right? And I don't know how escalation training works with police. I would love to see. I'm sure there's a lot of work being done there, but I have a chapter in the book called Biolinguistics, where I talk about that we have an idea of what language is, right? Okay, well, language has been reduced to this like information conveyance medium, right? Or it's like communication. And I really hate this because this sort of makes language out as if it's just this animal thing that we got from our ancestors and these primate ancestors. And it's just not at all what's going on with language. Language is lofty. Like it's so lofty that everybody has like their own idea of what words mean in their own heads, and they're constantly checking it with this ledger, right? And like in the fact that you're constantly checking it and seeing if everybody else agrees with you and like whether or not they agree with you with these terms means that you're like appealing to some kind of like arbiter, and you don't even know what that is, right? This is like this ledger, like who even decides, right? You don't know. It's just so far gone in the past, you have no idea. And so we all go to like what Merriam-Webster and like look at the etymology, and we try and debate that, and it's like, well, who decides that? Who decides this? Like, well, it's like nobody really agreed on anything. It's just like arbitered by this like force. It's like impossible to discern where that comes from. But no, instead, communication sciences say, nah, it's just, you want to talk about something, so you make a word for it, which is just complete horse shit. People don't make up words about stuff they want to talk about. That's never how it happens. There's always an etymology, right? And I recommend, by the way, Berlin and Kay's Basic Color Terms. This is a killer book. Basic Color Terms talks about how when every society, every language has two color terms, black and white. They all have this. And then it's kind of a toss up as to whether or not you have the remaining basic color terms. Red is always the next one that comes in, and then green or yellow in some order, and then blue always comes in, blah, 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 down the line. There are some tribes in the New Guinea highlands, I think, that like only have black and white. That doesn't mean that they can't see red and that they can't just talk about it. Of course, they can talk about it. They just don't have a specific word that means red. They'll say blood colored, earth colored. They'll say that, right? So it doesn't mean that you can't talk about the stuff. It's just, you just haven't like formalized a term around it yet, right? And so communication sciences would say, well, it's because, they haven't wanted to talk about red stuff. They haven't made their word for red yet. I hate this. This is what Edward Gibson did on Lex Friedman's podcast. He pulls this stuff, and I do not agree with this at all, and I would challenge him openly right now. He's at MIT. So this belief that language is just that it's just information. Okay, well then that just like opens up the floodgates. Okay, well then I can say, as long as the words are correct, I can say them however the hell I want. I can use whatever gesture I want. I can look wherever I want when I say it. No, in fact, all of that stuff is also language, right? Or it's at least some kind of deferential form that lends to language, right? All of these things sort of are built together within the lexicon, like the way that joint attention, your posture, your eye contact, everything. And escalation and de-escalation. De-escalation really needs to take advantage of knowing this, because otherwise, they're like you see a lot of these police officers that are, like body cam videos where the officer is just like shouting at the criminal like a gangster. Like it's like the police officer has been watching gangster shows and they're shouting at the criminal, "Yo, drop the fuck!" Like they talk like that, and it's like, okay, that gangster just hears his dad and he's not going to do that now. And then you get to shoot him. Yay. Like, it's not a victory. It's in the book. Um, okay, let's see. Eric, I still watch Beard Off. Love that video. Thank you. Thank you, Weird City. I, I was putting together a 12-hour version that looped. Would have been a big waste of time. Uh, let's move on here. So let's see. Oh, Lee's here. Hey, Lee. Good to see you. Glad you're tuning in. Yeah, I'm talking about the book. You emailed asking about the book, and this is kind of what it's about. Now, I'm gonna get to a couple more questions here, and then I want to talk about the next. I'm planning the next book now. Um, Rocks, Eric, you might be the wrong person to ask this, but I'm gonna try. Have you heard anything from Jacob on Midnight Fight Express? Any updates? I think he's working on something new, but I don't know. Thoughts on tennis rackets versus size? Oh, the age-old question. Yeah, I don't know. I think tennis rackets won that one, right? And then last, let's see. Divina says the police have a general theory they have a better weapon than you do, which is logic. I have a pistol when someone attacks with a knife. Yeah, I mean, but that's not the general theory of police. That would be the general theory of power. Um, Police are sanctioned. So even if police only had a stick and you had a gun, then that wouldn't that would still be the same sort of, they would still demand that you submit to them, right? It's just the reality is that because we have guns in this country in particular, police have to have guns. We can talk all day about banning guns in this country, which would be impossible because we have a 3,000-mile border. And as soon as you ban guns, they're all coming north, just so you know. And I don't want that. Not that I like guns. I like the fake guns. I don't like real guns. Ugh. Um, Weird City. Yeah, in the UK, most police are unarmed, whereas many criminals are armed. I mean, there's wasn't that always a gag in the Hong Kong movies? Like the police out. No, they had the gun on a tether. I mean, that's kind of a sad situation. Like here's the thing though, right? Like I have a story that I was walking with my sons in Vegas, and we were behind some grocery store picking dates. There's date trees everywhere here. And this guy walks up to me out of nowhere. He's homeless, clearly, and he's probably schizoid. He's mumbling, and he's like, "Hey, I got a knife in my pants." He's like talking about what he's gonna do to me because he's so out of it. Like he's getting ready to shank me. I assume he's talking about it. He's talking about how he's got a knife, and I grabbed my kids and ran off. But I thought about it, and I was like, I up until that point, about like a month before that point, I was open carrying. because in Las Vegas, in Nevada, you can do that. You can open carry. And I was thinking about getting a concealed weapon permit, right? I was thinking about doing that. And I started thinking, like, okay, if I had a gun, even if it was hidden on me, would I have acted the same way? Like, would I have run away? I don't know. I know everybody's going to be different. Like some people carry a gun and they're the coolest guy. When I carry a gun, I I I get nervous. I I don't like that thing on me. I I'm afraid to touch it. I'll admit. Like, and I've shot at a range, but there's just something about my personality that having a gun does something to me, and I will enter situations differently with a gun than without a gun. Now, that's not to say police shouldn't have guns, but what I'm saying is that even if somebody else has a gun, you knowing that they have a gun modifies your behavior. So I I don't know, like there's no policy here. I'm not talking any policy. The book, and by the way, the book is Apolitical, Zero Policy. Sorry, no policies. There's no liberal, there's no conservative. None of that. It doesn't matter. None of that shit matters in that book. All I talk about is the actual effects of what having a gun does. Now, some people might say that a police officer having a gun and not touching it, but just having it is effective, and that's good. Some people would say that a police officer having a gun affects people, and that's bad. And you see both all the time, right? There's no like universal rule about this, right? You might find 60-40, 60% good, 40% bad. Is that good? I don't know. That's policy. That's not where I go. But it is important to talk about the real effects of these things. So, um, okay. So again, I am not going to talk politics in here because I removed that car from the parking lot. I have 4 parking spaces in my brain. I go by the Adam Carolla rule. 4 parking spaces. I got my kids, I got my business, I got my book, and the fourth one is just like the latest thing that has to go in and out. And politics is not allowed in there anymore. So we can talk all day about like whether it's good or bad for police to have guns. This is not the point. The point is to talk about the science. The science of it is that when a gun is present, you don't even have to touch it. But if it's present, it has an effect. As long as you know it's there, it has an effect. It's called an affordance. If I hold this up, there's an affordance, especially if I can get it in focus. Okay, there. Now that it's in focus, your brain, if you're looking at this, your brain is trying to figure out how the hell to wrap your hand around this thing, right? If I hold up a flashlight, right, this has an affordance. If I show you the button, there's an affordance to that. Your brain is trying to figure out what to do, right? It's building this neural kind of blueprint. It's what's called an internal motor representation. The internal motor representation of this of this flashlight looks kind of like what my hand is doing right now. But maybe you've got some, maybe yours looks like this, right? So the fact that an object exists and you know about it, it causes your brain to react, whether you like it or not. If I hold my hand up to shake your hand, now that's not going to work here, obviously. You can't do it. But if you were here in front of me, this is an affordance with me holding my hand up. There's an affordance to this. If I hold up a coffee cup, if I hold a coffee cup up like this, the affordance in your brain kind of looks like this. If I hold the coffee cup up like this, the affordance changes to something like this. So the object itself and the person will have this intent on your brain. It creates an internal motor representation. There's a great book, by the way, a totally apolitical science book. Where is it? Mirrors in the Brain, this one. Rizzolotti's Mirrors in the Brain. Now, mirror neuron research, it's a little bit woo-woo, a little bit pseudoscience, but his data about internal motor representations and how he came upon that information, it's very good. Very good. Again, tons of pseudoscience around this crap, but in general, though, this is very good. That details how objects create affordances in your brain. right? And depending on whether you've used the object before or not, you will have a vocabulary of these like gestures and terms and usages, right? And then you can select from those. And if those are stored, and if you can access those cognitively, then you're not really like rushing to make a decision, right? So if you know, there might be like 8 options of ways that you can use this flashlight. Maybe there's like 4 options for using this. But if I hold up a pistol, then it's possible that people will have like a limbic response to that. I don't have one with me. I've got 80 prop ones in there, but I'm not going to go get one. But it's possible that, if you have trauma, the affordance is stored limbically, then it's like a fast response, and you start thinking like, well, I'm going to grab it and shoot it, and then like you might not want to touch it, you might not want to be around it, and whoever's holding that thing, you might just want to get away from them, and your attitude is going to change. That is true. Now, policy, whatever, like then you can make your policy decisions, but that is 100% reality. Okay, so that's me getting away from the politics. Don't care. Um, yeah, it depends on the individuals. I mean, it's also like, I mean, it's the same deal with violent video games, right? This is this is like a debate that just like won't die, and it should die. I think this debate should die, about violent media. It should die because there's no answer. There's no answer in general about media. Every game will have its own sort of thing, and every person will have their own way of playing the game, and every situation that the person is in will be its own response to that game. So you can have 1,000 situations where like a bunch of kids are playing violent video games and not shooting up schools, and then you have a situation where a kid shoots up a school because he played a violent video game, at least he says so. Okay, well, you just got to treat that situation as that situation, and like it's not a like then from there you do policy, right? It's fine, not my game, but undoubtedly, like video games, they have some effect. It's not that they have no effect, and undoubtedly they have some good effects. I think that we all know people who maybe a lot of us we thrived because we had video games, right? We got through some of our worst crises because we had video games. Like I have a lot of friends that went through divorces and they had video games, and like they swear by them now because like otherwise they would have been a hot mess, right? That's what they say. So getting away from the politics and just getting to the science of it, that's what the book is about. It's in the book. Flashlight is a very lethal weapon, actually, as Tak Sakaguchi proved this year in 1%. Is that the movie where he like takes the he like pulls the round out of the magazine and like it's so ridiculous, man. Okay, so I want to go to the next part of my yes, we do. Weird City, you're right. We make policy based on outlier incidents. I agree with you. Um, Not that that's right. And it's but like how we make policy is also a policy issue. Again, it's something like some places do policy really well. We got 350 million people. When we try and do policy for 350 million people, it's like crazy, right? When a city does a policy, it's a little bit different. You get a little bit more nuance. You try and do a federal law about guns, forget it. I will say that that's probably a bad idea. Um, all right, so Sonomura cooked with that one. Yeah. Um, so one of the topics for my next book that I wanted to propose is that because there are no we have unbelievable numbers of let me grab this one. Where is it? Is it this one? Yes. So this book is called Myths of the Origin of Fire. It's a great book. It's James Fraser. Critique him all you want. He wrote great books. And this is just like a list of I don't know, like like you can see how he organizes like Origin of Fire and where is that? Tasmania and Australia, Torres Straits, Melanesia, Polynesia, Indonesia, Asia, all of them, right? And he just kind of goes through and he's got like hundreds in every location. And that says something to me. What it says, and you got Greece, India, that says to me that people remember getting fire when I say people remember getting fire, there is a cultural memory around getting fire. And that's pretty interesting because it's a um, it's a technique. It's not something that you can just kind of do when you're born, right? There's no instinct for making fire. There's no there's no like obvious way to get fire except by following a lightning storm and going to an oak tree and grabbing an ember from it, right? So it says to me that fire was acquired and remembered culturally. In every society on planet Earth has like a history, like a myth about fire. Right? Prometheus, the one that brought fire down from the heavens, he was punished for it, for giving away this secret. Right? Like the Book of Enoch has some of this stuff too, or like these angels are like bringing wisdom down to people, right? And this is sort of like the ancient idea of like how innovation worked. Maybe there's like an origin of wheel in there too. I don't know. Okay, so and then there's Agni in Hindu myth. Um, okay, so then you've got the origin of fire. You also have origins of people. So in totemism and exogamy, I'm not going to pull it down because it's falling apart. Totemism and exogamy, Fraser again talks about how it kind of goes to the same places. The whole world talks about how everybody's got a myth of human origin coming from their totem. And I talked about this earlier, but uh, very few, if any, of these places have myths of the origin of violence. And that's shocking to me. It's totally shocking. And I looked and I looked and I looked. And there's a couple books. So the most obvious place to look for something like that would be, histories of like utopias back when things were peaceful. Utopias of the Classical World. That was one of the first ones I read. And then primitivism and related ideas in antiquity. Lovejoy and Boaz. Um, yes, flood myth. Everybody's got a flood myth. Fraser talks about those too. He has a really interesting breakdown of different flood myths. Like he even breaks down geographically, like how those floods may have happened. Um, I'm not saying anything about like stuff Graham Hancock is saying, but everybody's got a flood myth. Um, but the fact that nobody except for the story of Cain and Abel and Hesiod's Works and Days, as far as I've seen, there are no other myths of the origin of violence. And if we were first hunters, as Robert Ardrey and Raymond Dart claim, and then we eventually turned those weapons on each other, we would have a memory of that. Like that would be a moment. That'd be a pretty big deal. And yet, there's shockingly no myths about that. There are only these gods that sort of like have the ability to do that, but there's no moment when like the god came and introduced that and people said, "Oh, wow, I could stab that, I could do that, I can throw that rock. Oh shit!" Like there's no moment like that. It's just these gods that are just kind of like constantly out there, and it's almost as if like the human memory, cultural memory of violence has like no beginning. There's no origin to it. It's like it's always been. And so all we can do is sort of hypothesize like very mythical times when we didn't have that, but there's no way to know. Like there's never any kind of like clear moment like, oh, when this happened, that's when we got violence. Again, Works and Days, Hesiod, he says that violence begins with the Iron Age. You can kind of understand his reasoning. He's not right, because you can definitely do violence with stones and bronze. But with iron, it kind of takes on a different sort of quality, because with iron can slaughter wholesale because it doesn't uh, like the iron weapon doesn't diminish. That's the crazy thing about iron. Bronze, when your bronze weapon dulls, you have to shave it. You don't get to just hammer it back into shape. You have to shave it, sharpen it. Over time, that files down. So your bronze sword actually dies in like the ancient sense of the term. So there's there's an interesting theory. Lovejoy has a theory. Excuse me, Oakeshott has a theory that the when they first started shaving down bronze swords, at first the sword is a hacking tool, right? It's a hacking weapon. The more you shave it, what happens? It turns into a point. Now you can either get an expensive replacement, which like bronze is extremely expensive because you need tin. If you don't have tin, you don't have bronze. So you need tin and copper. It's expensive. It's like really expensive to make these things. So bronze weapons were like elite. That's why they're usually just tips of spears. Bronze sword is a big deal. So you're not going to go get a new bronze sword. You're going to sharpen it down. You get a thin stick eventually. And Oakeshott's theory is that that's where the poking arts came from, because it's actually technically extremely difficult to do fencing with a as a poking art. It's very difficult. It's much easier it's much easier to do that. You can't hire legions of people as fencers. It just doesn't work like that. Well, with iron that changes. With the Now Type 2 sword, or Naue, Naue, they were able to, well, with iron, you're able to now make a weapon that no longer gets shaved down, right? If your weapon dulls, you just take it to the smith. He'll heat it up and he'll hammer back into place. You don't lose an ounce of iron off that thing. It's like good as new. So iron swords had this like infinite. They had a life, right? Like iron had a life to it. That's why Japanese swords had spirits. You just don't really see this with bronze weapons. They don't really have the same spirit because they would break and they would die and they'd go away, and you'd get rid of them, you'd melt them down, use them for other things. It's this funny story where bronze would be used for church bells and cannons also. So there's this interesting trade between like churches and war and generals. So in Japan had guns just at the beginning of the shogunate. And what they started doing, I can't remember who it was, the emperor maybe. He had all these bells melted down. The bronze bells were melted down. They made bronze or brass, I guess, cannons. And then Japan abandoned the firearms around like 1640, I think. They abandoned firearms because it was completely destroying their chivalry. Because these like peasants would be like, it's easy. I don't have to learn sword. Beep beep. They hated that, so they banned firearms. But there's this interesting process that they did that. There's a great book about it. It's called Giving Up the Gun. And so what did they do? They took the cannons, they sold them for scrap in the South. They sold them to England. England bought a ton of scrap bronze at the time. And what did England do? They melted them down and made bells for Scotland. From bell to cannon to bell. So all this is to say that warfare is not really perceived as being contagious until the Iron Age. Right? That's when it's taken extremely seriously. Now, it's not that warfare wasn't taken seriously before that, because otherwise you wouldn't have elaborate kinship systems. You wouldn't have elaborate, Neolithic kinship systems and dowry and bride price and all this. All that was to defer violence. And the violence might have just been, maybe bows and arrows, but sometimes it's just, stone, axes. And so it's also just happens to be that the societies that are capable of making iron are also the ones that have written languages. And I don't think that that's random. I think that that's just that's a kinship thing where when you have an iron, when you finally have cities, the way that cities function, this is going to go off the rails. I'll try and keep it short. The only way that you can have a city is if you're transferring inheritance locally to you as a male, transferring inheritance locally to your sons so that they can stay in the estate that you're at, so that they can build onto the estate and create a fortified city. Without that, you don't have a city. You only have these flat kind of matrilineal networks, right? With patrilocal and patrilineal descent, patrilocal marriage, you have cities. You have Rome, Greece, India. You have China after the Shang dynasty, and then you can get fortified cities. And then with fortified cities, you have to have fortifications to build a forge that's hot enough to make iron. And so then also with a fortified city, because inheritance passes down locally, and because marriage is patrilocal, then women come into the male's household, sometimes not even from very far away. A lot of the time they speak the same language because you're in a city, and the city's language is very easy to codify. Whereas in a matrilineal system, you're constantly having dialects crossing over. Like the Philippines has like dozens of languages, and Indonesia has dozens of languages. It's not until you get like a settled sort of structure. This is not a random decision people make. This is like it has to be a kinship shift. It's really kind of dangerous, by the way. And if you don't have iron, you can't make that kinship shift. And as soon as you do, you can get iron, defend your city, and you'll consolidate the language. You get a written language. Anyway, so that means that people who are able to write were able to talk about violence, and they're the ones who are very concerned about iron violence. There it is. So even Cain and Abel, it's like seems as though like that is more concerned with iron violence, because right after that in the genealogy in Genesis, I guess it'd be 4 and 5. The genealogy I think is retconned. It used to be, I believe it used to be matrilineal. It's turned patrilineal. But there are two mentions of women, and those women have to do with the families. I think it's Tubal-Cain and like some other family, and those both have to do with forging. So there's some kind of importance in there around forges in the Bible, and interestingly too, and I think it's in there's a pseudepigraphic biblical book. What's it called? It's called Jasher. Yashar. And Jasher adds this detail to Cain and Abel. It says that Cain killed Abel with an iron tool. Interesting that the supposed like second and third men on planet Earth already had iron. Probably not happen. Not exactly how it happened. But then the Book of Jubilees, which is seen as like a more legitimate sort of text, says that it was a probably I think it says that it was a stone. I think it says specifically it was a stone. Which if that were true, then the author wouldn't be too concerned about um, not that concerned at least about contagious violence. So the Bible and Hesiod, both arguably only really concerned with the origin of violence with regards to Iron Age warfare. Otherwise, there's just not really anything there. And so this to me is evidence, well, at least it's a path to go down, that violence was there from the beginning with people. In fact, it's like the human operating system. And I would just call this I don't even know quite what to call it, but it's like if you kind of imagine all people at all times as having just like this basic operating system, call it the MS-DOS of people, MS-DOS 1. Well, MS-DOS 1 has reciprocal object-based aggression. That is sort of the defining trait of people. Now we could, at least it's the most easily discerned mode of people or a trait of people. It's the prime differentiator between humans and animals. And that's just like you can't really go like under that, right? Like you can't revert to some kind of earlier state than that. I'm not convinced at all that like you could, rewild yourself to forget that. I'm not convinced. I mean, maybe you could do an experiment, but my guess is that if you were to rewilding, it's this trend. People go out in the woods and try and get away from, houses and stuff, but they still use language. So if you were actually rewild, that would mean that you would have to remove yourself not only from architecture, but also from language and tools and clothing. So these people might enjoy that actually. It tends to be that kind of person. Uh, but like, what would that do? Well, you would have to have kids in that environment, and then you would have to like teach your kids not to use language. Like somehow you would have to not grammarize it. I don't think it's possible. I think the kids would just go back to MS-DOS 1.0 and they would have reciprocal object-based aggression. They would immediately start using deferral, and they would start grammarizing signs, and they would grammarize their objects. Like maybe they pick up the object that they're going to use in violence, and they realize that, oh, this is apocalyptic. Let's not use this. Let's make a sign out of this thing, and it becomes this first sign. It becomes a first word. And you just have like you just kind of repeat the whole thing over again. And maybe they'd have very small brains as a result. So that's what I would like the next book to be about. And I'm putting this out there because if anybody has examples of myths of the origin of violence, I would love to read them. I have my work cut out for me. I've got my, I've, this is my, these are some of the books I'm going to read for this. I got gonna read Nietzsche. I don't know why should I even read Nietzsche? It's the genealogy of morals. I don't know if that's necessary. I'm gonna try and like not read as much this time. There's ideology and utopia, Ovid's Metamorphoses. I think Ovid's got some stuff in there about violence. There's also this book that I found before philosophy. Maybe there's some stuff in there. Um, uh, I I'm, I should probably read Joseph Campbell. I actually don't like Joseph Campbell. Some cuneiform. I'm gonna read about cuneiform. Uh, seems important since it's like possibly one of the earliest languages. I don't know. Bhagavad Gita. There's another thing on primitive, whatever, pursue the millennium. There's a bunch of stuff. You guys don't care, but so that's sort of my the that's the academic stuff. And then I've got lists of myths, and I hate reading myth. I hate reading myth because I feel like I'm being lied to all the time. It's like you know, uh, like I'm reading Oedipus right now. The Oedipus cycle. Where is it? Now, if you just read the Oedipus cycle, if you read Oedipus Rex, right? Oedipus Rex is about King Oedipus, and he gets there's a an oracle that says that the man who killed his father and who married his own mother in an act of incest. I don't know if that word's going to get censored. That he is the cause of the plague, and that if he's exiled, the plague will end. And Oedipus comes to realize that that's him. He realizes that he killed his father because he's adopted. He actually killed his real father. He didn't even know it. Killed him on the road, and then he married the guy's wife, which was his mother, who had tried to abandon him, and he didn't know his mother, and his mother didn't know him. And so he inevitably fulfills this oracle. And he says, "Oh, how can I do this?" Blah blah blah. And his daughters, he's talking to his daughters. "Oh, you're my daughters, and you're also my sisters." And he can't even look at him anymore, so he gouges his eyes out and he leaves. He self-exiles. And then in the sequel, Oedipus at Colonus. Oedipus is on the road. He meets Theseus. He goes to Athens. Theseus is, um, long story short, Oedipus has this vision where he needs to die so that he can be an oracle for Theseus so that they can win the war in Athens. And so he goes and he like goes to some spot and he's alone with Theseus and he says like I'm going by the gods. It's my destiny to do this. And then it says what happens next is a mystery. But Oedipus dies. That's it. And you're like, oh, okay. So we're just supposed to believe that. We're supposed to believe this myth, and that's how it's laid out. You're just supposed to believe it. But there's a different reading, which is the Girardian read, and I recommend Violence in the Sacred for this. There's a different read of Oedipus, which says instead that Oedipus was possibly like a blind king, or maybe he was an oracle himself, who was sacrificed in an act of human sacrifice, like a mob killing. He might have been a king, he might have been an oracle. He was killed in order to, resolve this crisis, this plague. And the very cryptic kind of death scene in Oedipus at Colonus is, like kind of like all the evidence that you need, because it doesn't say how he dies. And so whoever wrote the story tried to hide the murder, if that's true, right? And that's what you always do with myth, is that you're trying to hide the body. You're trying to hide you're trying to hide the murder. You're trying to hide the truth. And I just get the feeling whenever I read myth that they're just lying to me, that they're lying to the reader. And that's like the whole point of the myth, is to like uphold some kind, you're trying to justify history. You're trying to justify possibly a murder or an exile. Um, and you do it through this very elaborate lens. Like there's another way of reading Jonah, right? Jonah and the whale. A great story. And if you're not familiar with Jonah, Jonah, God tells him, Jonah, go to Nineveh, tell them to repent or I'm going to destroy them. And he says, no, I don't want to. He runs away and he goes on a ship because he thinks God can't follow him, right? So he goes on the ship. Chapter 2, he's on the ship. There's a big storm on the sea. And so all the sailors on the sea, on the ship, they start saying, oh, let's start praying to these gods and idols. They put the idols out and they worship them. And Jonah says, no, no, none of that. Don't do that. Throw me overboard. It's because God is mad at me. So throw me overboard and then God will stop the storm. So they do. And the storm stops. Chapter 3 he goes into chapter 3 is that he doesn't die. He gets swallowed by a whale. He's in the whale's belly for 3 nights. He prays. In chapter 4 he gets spat out and he goes to Nineveh. He tells them to repent and they do, and God doesn't destroy Nineveh, right? Very nice story. But there's like another way of reading that story, which is that there are like two different paint jobs here. The first paint job, well, the first original story, most likely was about a man at sea during a storm, and that like the man was thrown overboard for the sea god so that the sea god would quell the storm. That was probably the first version of the story. And I don't think that that's like I don't think that's a biblical author's like starting off point. My guess is that this is like a very well-known story, because this is exactly how this is like sailors would do this all the time, by the way. Like you would throw human sacrifices overboard to quell the storm. You'd throw it to Neptune or Poseidon or whatever or you throw them to alligators in the river. Like, don't kill me when I cross the river. Here's a human, or here's a bride. Here, marry her. And it becomes this marriage ceremony. So version 2 of the myth is like, he says, "Oh, throw me overboard to Poseidon, and it'll stop the storm." This is actually, there's some Greek myths that are just like this. And so the first coat of paint is that he agrees to be thrown overboard, right? Or the virgin agrees to go and marry the alligator, and it becomes this very nice Beauty and the Beast story, right? When in reality she was thrown into a crocodile, and the crocodile devoured her because they tied her arms up. Right, that would be paint job number 2, but paint job number 1. But paint job number 2, and this is where like the Hebraic author comes in, says like, okay, not only that, but like we're actually going to demonstrate that the human sacrifice doesn't even work, right? So not only does he agree to get thrown overboard, but his death is not actually what causes the storm to stop. And you kind of notice in Jonah, they don't really elaborate on that. Instead, he just goes into the whale and he goes and accomplishes his task. But a paint job number 3 would have like made this a little bit better, where he would have said like, these idols don't really matter. In fact, like the storm is going to quell. If we just sit here and pray right now, this will all end. We just have to acknowledge whatever, and then they have some kind of moment and they break bread or whatever. That would have been paint job number 3 that they never did. But like myth in general, like is only at paint job number 1. It tends not to go to paint job number 2. Paint job number 1 is the worst, because you don't know what happened and you don't have literary criticism on top of it. You see this a lot with like Buddhist. There's these like Buddhist glosses of old Shinto myths, like these totem myths, and they're just so shoddy. Like it is kind of a paint job too, but it's so shoddy. It's like, the dog and the butterfly, they were gonna fight, and but they got together and they prayed to Buddha 3 times and the fight ended or something. Like it's really like shoddy. It looks like the Buddhist scribes just went in and like doctored it up and put their signature on it and passed on, went on to the next myth, right? So I have to so like all these myths are exhausting to read. I hate reading them, because it's like you're always asking, like, what does that mean? What does the butterfly mean here? Is that like a totem clan, or does that mean something? I don't like reading myth, but I'm going to for this book. I'm gonna take some more questions, then I gotta get out of here. Oh, there's a lot of questions in here, or debates. Let's see. Brox Rock says, I find it ironic how in a lot of biblical stories, the people that progress the civilization to what it is today, they get punished for it, but we're meant to celebrate and prize the punishers. I'm not quite sure what that means. Maybe you can elaborate. Jeff Curry says, it's interesting that violence has no origin, but it's just accepted as natural. Yeah, it's kind of like it's just this human condition, but we never really like allow it without rules, right? The only way that we can allow violence is within like strict confines, right? Like combat, like UFC or even like the Roman gladiator games. It had to be very tightly controlled. Had to be within these like very strict confines. Otherwise, like you just weren't allowed to have it. It's just like even like Putin attacking Ukraine. It's like, well, you can't have that unless you're following these rules. It's like we're sort of acknowledging like you can attack Ukraine, you can kill people, but you have to follow these rules before doing so. Let's see. Leonardo Silva says violence is a reaction basically to something we create a value to violence that on nature does not exist. I think the issue here is that we should leave semantics out of the equation. Not quite sure what that means. Brox asks, if violence is a universal constant, then does that mean the ones who are the best, most efficient at it hold the most value worth socially when push comes to shove in a survival of the fittest way? No. I think that the people who are best at doing violence are not the ones that win. The ones who are best able to craft rules under which, you know, violence is deferred, those societies are going to last the longest. Um, Societies that just openly allow violence at all times, like when I say violent, like we have to be very clear on our terms. Warfare is not violence. This is really important. Warfare always has rules. There's always a rule. It's bound by retribution at all times. I mean, it's almost like violence itself. So I differentiate warfare and violence. It's kind of a subtle difference, but warfare is sanctioned combat and violence is unsanctioned combat. And this plays out in politics, right? Like you'll get Chomsky saying, the war in Iraq is violence, but peasant uprisings are like legitimate warfare or they're deterrence or something like that, right? Um, and then you'll get people on the other side saying like, no, the wars overseas are totally legitimate. That's war. And then peasant uprisings where they're, whatever that's violence. So it tends to be, but I think people tend to agree that like violence is more bad and warfare is more good than violence is, right? Um, and so in order for there to be any kind of violence, it just has to be bound by rules. And I don't think that necessarily like whoever's the best ones at doing violence are going to be the ones that survive. I think that like you get like how would you explain the technocrats in the Soviet Union, right? These aren't guys that are like tough guys on the street. These are elite, like bred for politics. These are politicians bred through and through. The guys that have to go out and shoot rifles a lot of the time nowadays, the technocrats tend to look at the rifle guys, the infantry, they look at them as like lower class. So even though like the infantry, if push came to shove in the streets, like the technocrat doesn't have a chance. He just has a button he can push. So it's not necessarily true. But that's just kind of like the interesting workings of human hierarchies. Leonardo says violence is just reaction. Is an amoeba eating another violent? No. No, I would not say that. I would say that's either predation, or eating. I think to use violence as a term within animals, within animal societies, I think that that's a big mistake because now again, so again, if you do that, you're blurring the line between the two, right? So you can't even compare even chimpanzee combat to human combat. No, there's no comparison. The fact that we have the button and we could eradicate chimpanzees. There's 50,000 of them. We could eradicate them tomorrow. It actually takes a lot of effort for us not to eradicate them. It's sad, but that's reality, right? So we have to be very careful about our terms. Would never say that animals are violent. They have combat and predation. That's pretty much it. Um, let's see. Let's keep going down. This is fun. Thanks everybody for all these great questions. um, the GEC03, much of human sensibility and morals boils down to aesthetics at the end of the day. I like that. I like that. I love aesthetics. I love talking about aesthetics because there's always this vector within every human aesthetic. Like yeah, like I was like even a flashlight. Like there's an aesthetic to this flashlight. It's very American, which is not a it's not a term of endearment necessarily. American aesthetics are very like brute force. You're sort of trying to sell it to a cop and a mechanic, right? Like that's what you're doing with your flashlight. So they tend to look a certain way. But then within that, when you're trying to sell a flashlight to a like if you're trying to sell a oh, here. So in America, the most successful flashlight company is Maglite, and they have an interesting sort of history where they were able to get a killer contract with police. And the thing about Maglites is that these are indestructible. Although I've broken one, but like you can break windows with this. You can, if you had to, you could smash someone on the head with it if you had to, right? So there is this like violent appeal to a Maglite in a sense. And for a mechanic, it's sort of like a different reason. Like as a mechanic, you're constantly dropping your stuff. My dad is a mechanic and he sold tools for a living, so I was checking in his tools all day. So I know tools really well. In fact, he gave this to me. He would sell these. He was a Snap-on tool dealer. Um, and are there batteries in this? I should probably take these out. Ooh, yeah, I gotta take those out. Oh, they're not coming out. Oh, it's really bad. That's really bad when the batteries don't come out of your Maglite. This thing's toast. Anyway, so aesthetics, you could argue that you could probably argue that anything could go back to some kind of violent origin. I don't think that that's necessarily true. And that's why I don't think that these were originally for like hunting or even, I don't even think they were tools. I think they were originally, they had some other aesthetic purpose, probably more along the lines of a cut gem. So here's another way of looking at something like an Acheulean hand axe. I'm just going to hold up the certificate just so that people don't think I'm BSing. This is my certificate for the Acheulean hand axe. Okay, it's authenticated by Western Typology. They're legitimate, and this thing is supposedly, what does it say, 1.6 million to 200,000 years before present. Okay, that's this, supposedly. I don't know how he gets that date. No idea. I think that he's just going off of I don't know. He can speak to that. But anyway, um, forgot what I was saying. Well, anyway, the hand axes being an example of like aesthetics where I know if for example we when we get married a lot of us get diamond rings. It would be like in 10,000 years if somebody started digging up our bodies and they find diamond rings and then they say, oh, look at that, everybody carried around these little cutting tools on their ring fingers. So because diamonds are the best cutting tools in the world. So I think that that's probably what we're doing with these right now. I think we might be looking at these like, oh, look, these are things that people use to cut. Now, if anybody has a video, please show me of any video of somebody cutting an Acheulean hand axe and using it to actually cut something. Because, again, as a kid who was raised on checking in tools, grew up around tools, this has no affordance for my hand anywhere. I can't find a place to grab this. You might say, oh, you could do it in this little nub at the end there, but it's like, That's horrible tool design. You would not do that as a thumb, as like a thumb point. Like that's going to cut your thumb off. So any place where you apply, and by the way, it's dull not by design. It's dull because it's been sandblasted for a million years, right, or however long. I think it's possible then that like these or any kind of tool, like I was talking about the karambit, might have origins that aren't just violent. Like they might have very sacred origins where it's like the point of the tool was sacrificial or deferential or linguistic or it's for kinship, and it only later was co-opted for violence. Okay, I could go all day about aesthetics. Thank you, appreciate that. We do a whole thing on vaporwave sometime. Uh, Jackson Nguyen, brother, the story of Oedipus never happened in Greek mythology. He never existed. It's just a play. Okay, but why would you tell the story like that, right? This is my question. Why would you tell a story like this about a man who is who is accused of of patricide based on an oracle, right? This is clearly a blueprint, at least, of something that would actually happen, right? Like whenever you would sacrifice kings, for example, like you always have to concoct a story for the king to be guilty. There's always has to be some story concocted. So whether or not Oedipus is real, like this is a style of storytelling that justifies myth that at its origin might have had a human sacrifice. There very well could have been a murder. And even if it's just one, if that lays the blueprint for your entire mythology, then your entire mythology is based on a lie. Like the idea, for example, like we have this myth nowadays that um, Jordan Peterson loves this one, like the story of the dragon, right? It's this archetype about facing our fears, and that the dragon represents the shadow, and we have to attack the shadow in order to grow, right? And he's got the princess, and that means that when we attack the shadow, we assimilate the shadow to our ego, and we get to grow and we get married, and it's a story about growing up, right? Okay, well that's probably not why dragon myths exist. Dragon myths, you always have to look for like a real concrete reason why these things exist. Now you could say, like, well, dragons don't exist anyway, so it's just a story. Well, that's beside the point. Like nobody just concocts this stuff out of nowhere. So the idea of a dragon, it almost always starts out as a water spirit. Okay, so we got to get that out of the way first. And so the fact that like Chinese water spirits having these like twisting and curving turns seems to represent waterways and like flood plans and whatnot, right? Okay, and also like dragons, like I mentioned, the offering to the dragon originally was in order to allow you to cross a river, so you could cross a ford, for example. So you'd throw a virgin to the alligator, you make an offering to an alligator, you cross, and then later on it becomes a myth about offering a girl to like the alligator prince or whatever it might be. Okay, and then later on that might then become okay. So you make this offering to an alligator, all right, to this dragon. This dragon is like taking women from you, and as he's marrying these women, right? Well, okay, let's say you build a bridge. Medieval Europe comes around, builds a bridge. You don't need to offer this to a dragon anymore, but that dragon myth is still around. So what are you going to do with it? You have to put a new coat of paint on it. So what do? You go across the bridge and you rescue the princess now. So it's like I think that that's like a much more, like holistic way of looking at myth rather than just saying, well, it's made up, it didn't actually happen. So chill out, Eric. Well, okay, then don't listen. Okay. Let's see. What else we got here? Like, I think Eric should read Robert Sapolsky instead of looking for philosopher writers that talk about violence. Yeah, I have Sapolsky's book, and I take a major issue with this idea of like the reptilian brain. I don't think he calls it that. He does have like these like three levels of brain though, right? And what he does is he sort of like chalks aggression up to some lower emotional and sometimes even lower than that, like a limbic response to stimuli. And I think that just like is a huge injustice to what makes us human to say that there's like these three different brains that are like evolutionarily like more or less evolved than the other one. Like this just doesn't indicate to me that This again is going to it's going to mask this difference between humans and animals, which I have a big issue with. And this is something like Neil deGrasse Tyson keeps on every time. Like I have like a bunch of podcasts I subscribe to, and he's always on one of these fucking podcasts, like talking about how as humans we need to humble ourselves into understanding that we're just animals and we're not special. I'm so tired of hearing this. Like nobody wants to hear this crap. Like everybody wants to understand why it is that we have a crisis in violence and animals don't. Everybody wants to understand this, right? And so if we're just chalking it up to like the mammalian, like the reptilian brain or some kind of like lower evolved brain, okay, well then you again you're losing. You're gonna get lost in the weeds because then you have to find the moment of transition from when we went from tool using apes to warring humans, and like nobody seems to be able to do that. And so what I'm proposing is that like there's a very clear differentiator between humans and animals, which is that we use reciprocal object-based aggression and they don't. But I am going to read Sapolsky, just not yet. This book's huge, by the way. Okay, let's see. I might move on here. Some violence, race, chemistry. Um, yeah. Trying to understand this comment. The Gecko 3. Yeah, it rubs me the wrong way when people throw out theories on human nature being almost completely taught. I'm not quite sure what that means. Um, Leonardo, everything is evolutionary and hardwired. I don't agree with that at all. No, I think that the fact that we have reciprocal object-based aggression is like constantly renewing human relations and constantly renewing language. None of that's hard. I don't think any of that's hardwired. All that is like fabrication and carpentry. Like all this stuff around us is not hardwired, right? And this is stuff that we're constantly referencing in order to like understand the sort of like all of it has symbolic content, and you experience this when you leave your house and you go somewhere else and you suddenly have a different personality or you're yearning to go back, right? So I just don't think that we're nearly as hardwired as we've been led to believe. I think even like personality traits or like at a base level, like I don't think that there's like a huge difference between people. And like one issue too, I mean, this is my like complete anti-racist screed, which is that I think that like every race is sort of like wired the same way, and that like it's just like a matter of how we sort of self-domesticate over time in order to resolve violence, and everybody does it, right? There's no race that like emerges out of the woods that's like evolved to like engage more in violence. It's like there's no such thing. Everybody's got white palms, everybody's got white sclera. All of it helps us to understand the intentions of other people. Like there's no people that don't have white sclera, right? And like the only time you don't have white sclera is if you're too tired, right? And like when you're tired, and so when you sleep, that sort of like renews your sclera and it helps you to engage in joint attention with other people, and that defers violence. So everybody has the same operating system. It's all the same. Now, if that's what's hardwired, fine. At a baseline, we all have this. But like from that, it just sort of like projects outward into personalities and languages and all that. And that's I just don't think that like that stuff's nearly as like hardwired as we've been led to believe. Let me see. Diogo. Oh, hi. I wonder, for example, Japan used to be very violent during Sengoku, etc., before Meiji Restoration. Nowadays, they have very low criminal rate, collectivism mindset. Um, yeah. I don't know. Violent during Sengoku. Yeah, there were tons of yes, but the violence was because they didn't have an emperor, right? The violence, and that was the argument of the emperor was that we have to have an emperor so that we stop having this violence. Um, I mean, it says you say nowadays they have low criminal rate, they have low crime rate. So, okay, you tell me, would you rather have uh, American Compton style violence where you can leave and go to a city that doesn't have Compton style violence? Or would you like a system like Japan where there's like a low level of violence everywhere, but as soon as you have a board meeting, you might get Yakuza in there who are demanding that you trade a certain way. Like, which one do you prefer? So I understand, like, there's this mythos about Japan that it's this like, and I love it, by the way. Like, I love the mythos about Japan, like how it's so clean and there's no crime on the streets. But you have to understand that organized crime in Japan has a relationship with the government. And this is something that in America we've fought pretty hard to stop, and with more success than Japan has had. And of course, there's cronyism. There's always going to be cronyism, but there is going to be an inverse relationship. So people talk about Vegas, for example, right? Like they talk about Vegas in the 80s. It's like there's no crime anywhere because the mob had control. It's like I don't know which is better. Like I have a business, and when I moved here, I was kind of like, am I going to get a guy knocking on my door at some point? Who's connected? Is that going to happen? Because I don't know what I'm going to do. I'm not really looking forward to that. And instead, we haven't gotten that, but we do get, guys cutting our catalytic converters off and stealing mail. Which of those do I prefer? Right now, I don't want mob. Sorry. I don't want organized crime. I just would rather not. I would rather have certainty. Even though the government doesn't do its job entirely. Like it doesn't like clean up the streets. Not that you can just do that. But if I had to pick between like a generally violent society and one that's run by organized crime, I think right now I would rather have a more generally violent society. That might change. It is a problem. Uh, okay, let me see here. Finishing up here. Diego, example from Vite. Just gonna keep moving on. I have one question. Okay, Leonardo, you seem to approach violence to an almost philosophical optic. Why not go to the most scientific approach, the biological one? Yeah, but nobody knows the biology of violence, right? All they keep doing is they sort of associate human violence with like hormones and whatnot, and like you can't reduce aggression to hormones. If you did that, then you could just like single out segments of the population who are going to be more violent. That's just not how people work. We're not reduced to biology. This is what racists did. They did single out biology, right? They did all their like research and they found genetically, well, these people are more these people are more criminal and they're genetically more predisposed, and like that ended up not being true, right? Because it turns out that as soon as you remove those people from that situation, then like they just act differently. So I'm not I'm not saying that that like not against science, but I'm against these scientists that had these theories, because in general the theories have been very vague and nobody has differentiated human combat from animal combat. So if you don't even have a philosophical difference, if you don't even have a philosophical difference between humans and animals, and if your philosophy is that like, well, we're just kind of the same, we're just, then like, why would I read the science? There's like, I'm not interested. Um, okay. I think that's it. I'm going to do one last comment. Brox rocks. There is that age-old joke in regards to mafia and the government. What's the difference between the government and the mob? One of them is organized. I like that. That's a good note to end on. There's a really good book. Where is it? There's the Hung Society, which is about triad initiations in Hong Kong or in Singapore, but it relates to Hong Kong, and it's sort of like the close connection between triads and like the Chinese myth, and also Yakuza. What's it called? Yakuza and what's it called? Oh, Japan's Criminal Underworld. It's another one. I'd get it, but it's too far away. Um, I think I'm just too American to do the organized crime thing. Like I was like I when I was in Hong Kong, I did a movie in Hong Kong. You guys know I did a Hong Kong movie? You'll never see it. I did a Hong Kong movie with Carter Wong. You'll never see it. I can't find it. If I could find it, I'd put it online, but I don't think you'll ever see it. It's called Stop Hit. Did it 10 years ago. I think Mike Leader wrote a review of it, but it's gone now. I'm not sure why. At any rate, it's not a very good movie. But I fight one of the EMC guys in it, which is why I would have liked to see it. And when I was in Hong Kong, like there was a moment when I learned, and I'm not speaking for anybody in particular on the set, but there was a moment when I learned just how connected everybody was to organized crime, even in 2014. And it was very unnerving because I that's just not my game, man. Like I'm just not I'm not cut out for that. And there was an aspect of me that felt like I was in a second world country, you know. And there are parts of America that are like that too, where the government and the and crime just like work hand in hand, kind of openly. And I know that it's just a city, you know, and it's traditionally in the South, it's like the idea of organized crime is kind of a new idea anyway. Um, because in a way, like organized crime is a paradox. It's not really like it's not really a thing. Like you just have families that have it's like a smaller government. So I mean, my own definition of it is like tainted by being an American, right? And because my understanding of a gangster is anybody who doesn't conform to the government. But a lot of the world has this kind of like semi-cozy relationship between government and crime. And a lot of there's a lot of places in America that are like that. Um, and I just remember like when I realized that when I remember that moment in Hong Kong and I got scared and I just wanted to go home. So yeah, Davina says lots of Hong Kong's business and culture is saturated in corruption and organized crime. Yeah, and I think maybe like all things equal, um, maybe that works. You know, there's a system to that. There's a system to family feuds, right? There's a system to small towns kind of like operating through family networks. There's a system to that, and you know that you see this conflict in the in America with first the East Coast kind of like corporate types fighting against the South, who are the patrilocal plantation owners. Um, and like only one of those could win because those are vastly different kinship systems. And then as soon as the South lost and the move west during Manifest Destiny, when you hit groups like the Mormons, where they have their own sort of kinship style that they want to do. There's a lot of gangsterism, especially around like here. I mean, there's a ton of old like card houses that were Mormon hangouts. Mormons are very different than what they used to be. Used to be gangsters, right? But gangsters in the sense of like they were just families trying to like run things their way. A lot of them were bigamous or polygamous, and I think that they just were. I think they just took that from Native Americans a lot of the time. They probably found a lot of defense of that in the Bible. Um, Abraham had two, and Jacob had four wives, and so crime in that sense is like a very kind of fluid idea. And so when I say organized crime, I mean anything that's not sanctioned by the government, and that allows me like a clear head to just kind of go about my business. And it's much easier for somebody like with my style of thinking to operate in those situations where everything is like fairly certain. I don't have to deal with relationships, right? I don't have to deal with like oh, this new local guy's got like hair up his ass about something. He wants to put his son in my mocap studio, and I gotta pay him or whatever. I just don't. I wouldn't want to deal with. I would leave. I would just leave. I would go to a different city, and there'd be some other mocap company that would come here and do it instead. Um, so is that better? Is that worse? I don't know. Seems to work for Japan. Like Japanese people seem to thrive there. I wonder if Japanese people come to America and they're like, how can you just let the government run the drugs and prostitution? How can you just let the government do that? You might think that. I don't know. They might find it very strange. They might think that we're very dysfunctional in that way. That was fun. So the book is coming out in a month. I have a copy editor working on it now, and I plan to have all the edits back early next month, and I'll put my final touch on it. Probably get a few more updates, a few more pieces of feedback from people. If anybody's interested in reviewing it, by the way, um, if you're able to review it over the holidays and get feedback back to me by, I don't know, like um, January 3rd. What is that? I don't even know what day that is. If you're able to do that, then I'd be willing to send you a PDF. Let's see, what is that? Yeah, January 3rd is a Friday. No pressure. Um, Legendary on, yes, Zelo is in the Hong Kong movie. He's a good friend of mine. He's a good friend of mine. He's in the book. I wrote about him a little bit. I have a big heart for that guy, and he, he's very American. And when we were in Hong Kong together, I felt like we were very tight over there because I think we were like the two most American people there. All right, so if you want to read the manuscript, you can email me, business@ericjacobus.com, and I'll send it to you. Thank you all. Be in touch. Thanks.